Hello, and welcome to the Program Monitoring Validation Training for Title I Part C Migrant Education Program. First, we would like to share some things to keep in mind regarding this program monitoring validation process. Please note that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. Another thing to note is to ensure overall compliance with program requirements. LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. In addition, please keep in mind that the documentation requested for submission during the program monitoring validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. If meeting documentation is to be provided for any requirement, please consider the following. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting notes and/or minutes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is an acceptable form of documentation. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be an acceptable substitute for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need for a participant signature. We want to provide you with some additional guidance regarding the documentation requested as part of this year's program monitoring validation for the Title I Part C program. We will only be accepting documentation for the previous school year to ensure that TA is provided with adequate documentation to support the selected requirement.
This section includes an overview of the interstate, intrastate coordination requirements included as part of the program monitoring validation process. Interstate, intrastate coordination. The LEA ensures interstate and interstate coordination of services for migratory children to provide educational continuity through timely transfer of pertinent school records, including information on health, when children move from one school to another, whether or not those moves occur during the regular school year. This is according to Section 1304(b)(3). The first type of documentation that we're going to be looking for documented interstate and interstate coordination is 1.1 M6 notifications. This is an essential process in the migrant education program. The acceptable documentation for 1.1 is a minimum of 2 but no more than 4 samples of M6 notifications. This can be either the emails that you receive or a spreadsheet that shows the different type of M6 notifications. This includes both move notifications and data requests. As mentioned before, for item 1.1, the acceptable documentation is a minimum of 2 but no more than 4 sample M6 notifications. The following issues may result on an improvement needed status. The audible documentation requested was not submitted. The documentation submitted doesn't reference interstate or intrastate coordination. Again, this has to do with those move notifications and data requests, or the sample documentation was not for the prior year. Documentation required 1.2. Copies of call logs. The acceptable documentation for this is a minimum of 2 but no more than 4 samples of call logs documenting communication between the LEA/ESC MEF staff and the receiving or sending LEA or state, if applicable. If not applicable, please provide a comment explaining why this type of service was not required. Another thing to note is that when submitting call logs, it's really important that we have enough information that documents the date, the topic that was discussed, and also the efforts that were taken to resolve this type of request. As mentioned previously, for 1.2, the required documentation is a minimum of 2, but no more than 4 samples of call logs documenting communication between the district or ESE staff and the receiving or sending district or state. The following issues may result in an improvement needed status. The audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted doesn't reference interstate or interstate coordination. This is where it's really crucial that we see enough evidence in those call logs that provide us enough information to determine that this call was related to the interstate or interstate coordination, or the documentation is not for the prior school year. Documentation required. 1.3 copies of emails. The acceptable documentation is a minimum of 2, but no more than 4 sample emails between the LEA/ESE MEP staff and the receiving or sending LEA/state, if applicable. If not applicable, please provide a comment explaining why this type of service was not required on the previous year. Issues that may result on an improvement needed status for 1.3 are the following. The audible document requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted does not reference interstate or interstate coordination, or no comment was provided explaining why the type of server was not required, or the documentation submitted was not for the prior school year. Documentation required. 1.4 Written procedures for sharing/obtaining student records. The acceptable documentation is the written procedures followed for sharing or obtaining migrant student records with or from other districts or states. It is crucial that districts have this in place. All districts should ensure that they have written procedures that allow users to understand how they should be requesting or responding to requests from other states or districts when it comes to move notifications or data requests. Issues that may result on an improvement needed status for 1.4 are the following. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. The documentation submitted doesn't reference interstate or interstate coordination. In this section, it's really important that when districts submit their written procedures, there is clear evidence of the steps that MEP staff needs to follow when it comes to responding or requesting either move notifications or data requests, or the documentation submitted was not for the prior school year. If no migratory student records were requested during the school year, the following documentation must be readily available upon request. Documentation required for 1.5. Documentation that shows why there was no request for records from another LEA or state, or there was no need for this type of service. The accepted documentation is a written statement that states the following, and it's important that the districts or the ESCs include this statement. There was no request for records from another LEA or state, or had no need for this type of service due to no mobility. It's really important to understand that if the children identified in your district did not have mobility, there won't be a need for either move notifications or data requests from other districts within the state or from other states. Issues that may result on an improvement needed status for 1.5. The audible documentation requested was not submitted. The documentation does not include the statement about why there was no request for records from another LEA or state, or there was no need for this type of service. And we provided you the type of statement that you need to include in your documentation for this. Also, the documentation submitted was not for the prior school year. If no migratory student records were requested during the school year, the following documentation must be readily available upon request. Documentation required for 1.6 is the TXNGS student unique count. The acceptable documentation for this is the TXNGS student unique count report for the prior school year showing no students were identified. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status for 1.6 are the following. The audible documentation requested was not submitted, or the documentation submitted was not for the prior school year.
Thank you for your participation in this overview of the Program Monitoring Validation process for the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program.